All right, so I'd like us to get on to our explainer here on the program tonight. And if we can just get started with the issue of Kenya's grey listing, right? Now, on the 23rd of February this year, Kenya was grey listed. The conversation quickly shifted to what this means for us as a country. But I want us to break it down today. Who does this grey listing? What does it mean? What was Kenya flagged for? And what steps can we take to get the country off this list? Now, next, I want us to start talking about exactly that. So let's start with who does this listing. The organization is known as the Financial Action Task Force, FATF. It is the global money laundering and terrorist financing watchdog. Now, it's an intergovernmental body that was formed in 1989 by the G7 countries, and it seeks to set the global standards to counter money laundering. Now, it later expanded its mandate to include measures to combat financing terrorism following the 9/11 attacks in the US. Now, the Financial Action Task Force has 39 members. This includes regional bodies like the European Commission and the Gulf Cooperation Council. There are also associate members and those with observer status, such as the World Bank, the IMF, and UN law enforcement bodies. Kenya is a member through one of the regional bodies called the Eastern and Southern Africa Anti-Money Laundering Group. Incidentally, Kenya took the helm of this group in September last year. Now, next, the organization works to ensure the integrity of the international financial system. So what they do is they set a list of recommendations that touch on a country's legal, regulatory and operational measures to protect them from the threat of money laundering and terrorism financing. Now, they hold 3 meetings every year to evaluate how countries are effectively implementing the laws and regulations. This is by the countries adopting the FATF standards into their local national laws and regulations. This is evaluated through what is known as a mutual evaluation process. Next, let's understand this. Now, this mutual evaluation process is actually some type of peer review mechanism where countries evaluate each other on how well they're implementing the standards. It is a continuous process. Now, they're looking at 2 key areas. One is the technical. So, does the country have the right institutions, laws, and procedures to fight money laundering? The second is effectiveness. Are those laws and institutions in fact effective in countering those financial crimes? So what you're saying is, do they have any impact on the ground? Now, it is on this basis that they list countries depending on their level of compliance. Now, here are the lists. Now, the countries on the blacklist are those that do not meet the standards and are not even seen to be making efforts to meeting the benchmarks that have been set. Countries like North Korea and Myanmar are on the blacklist. Then we've got the whitelist. These are the good guys. They're the ones compliant with the standards set and are continuously working to keep it that way. Finally, we have the grey list. These are countries that have fallen short of the standards or been found to be deficient in some ways. But the task force also acknowledges that there are efforts towards better action. Now, countries that are on this list are put under increased economic supervision and regulation. It is important to note at this point that the Financial Action Task Force does not have enforcement mechanisms. But we'll come back to that and talk about that a bit later in terms of the consequences of these listings. But first, let's go to the next step, which is how many countries are on the grey list? Well, globally, there are 21 countries on the grey list. But here in East Africa, Kenya now joins Tanzania, South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, this means that more than half of the countries of the East African community are on the watchdog's grey list. Now, at this point, I must mention that Uganda, which has been on the grey list, was actually taken off the list on the very same day that Kenya was put on the list. The task force noting that there had been some substantial improvements in Uganda's efforts towards compliance. So, here's the big question. Why was Kenya grey listed? Well, before we get there, let me just say that this is familiar territory. Kenya has been grey listed before. in 2011. It took us 4 years to get off the list, which happened later in 2014. But let's come back to present day. So Kenya was grey-listed at the Financial Action Task Force meeting that was held in Paris on the 23rd of February this year. It followed a long process that actually began with a mutual evaluation process that we've talked about that started in 2022. This time, Kenya has been asked to pay special attention to these areas. Among them is to increase the investigations and prosecutions of those involved in money laundering and financing terrorism. The country has also been asked to ensure that the financial intelligence information that is gathered in the country of suspicious activity is used more effectively. Kenya may also need to take a closer look at the work of NGOs and not-for-profit organizations to ensure that they do legit work and are not used as conduits to transfer proceeds of crime. Now, the beneficial ownership of trusts is also something to take a closer look at. Who owns the trusts? Who runs them? Or who is behind them? And where is that money coming from? Now, other non-financial professions that require stricter supervision and regulation are law, real estate, accounting, as well as the area of cryptocurrency. Now, these are just some of the areas that have been flagged by the task force. Now, next, let's talk about what I'd mentioned earlier, if we can move on to the next one. This grey listing was part of a process that, we said started in 2022. And since then, when some of the issues were raised in that mutual evaluation report, Kenya's National Treasury says it has made some efforts to address the issues. Among them is to make amendments to the law, including 17 amendments to the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2023 to try and address the deficiencies that were pointed out by the report. Notably, on the issue of the legal profession, one of the noted deficiencies was the failure to designate lawyers as reporting institutions. This means that they would need to flag any suspicious activity in their work and with clients. Now, they say this was addressed by the Proceeds of Crime and Anti-Money Laundering Amendment Act of 2023. That was followed by a signing of an MOU with the Law Society of Kenya. Now, the amendment to that law allows lawyers to report money laundering or any suspicious activity, and they do that through the Law Society of Kenya. Another major deficiency was Kenya's failure to effectively address economic crimes, and in particular corruption, to the extent of failing to prioritize corruption as a high-risk area in Kenya's national risk assessment. Now, the National Treasury, in response to this grey listing, notes that the strategic deficiencies are there, and they also say that more work continues to be done to ensure compliance. So that's what the Treasury is saying. Next, let's look at what this means for all of us as a country and for businesses. Now, as we've said, the Financial Action Task Force does not have enforcement mechanisms per se. This is more of a reputational issue. And reputation in the world of finance and economy is everything. In practical terms, being on the grey list means that we are seen as a country through which money is laundered, or wash-wash country, as you hear many people saying. So what does this signal trigger? Well, IMF and World Bank, which enjoy observer status at FATF, would add some more stringent conditions aligned to the concessional loans they give us to ensure that we are countering this vice. Sometimes, some countries are in fact denied access to some facilities by these lenders based on this listing. International banks would need to increase their due diligence when doing work with either Kenyan companies or Kenyan banks, because they wouldn't want to be flagged either. So that would mean some more stringent terms for companies that are, for instance, in export, or even some higher interests in loans and facilities to cater for that risk. That means the cost of doing business goes up. Remember, we also talked about NGOs needing closer scrutiny. This could affect their funding, as donors would have to exercise more caution in giving them funds. That could affect their social impact. So I want you to imagine all of the sectors, and there are many that are heavily dependent on not-for-profit organizations in this country. Any funding that is either reduced or delayed could affect those citizens who depend on their work. So these are the consequences of that. And the main question that I would now like to get into with my guest here for a moment is just how does Kenya get itself off this list? Those are the questions that we would like to now get into.